recording. Thank you. So Mojca Ramšak is an anthropologist that works at the University of Ljubljana. She's a full professor. And she actually wrote one of the first thorough publications on oral history in Slovenia. This is Portrait Glasov, or Portrait of Voices. And she really did quite an extended text on oral history, including text on considering the ethics in oral history, but the empirical part of it was connected to the Carinthian Slovenes, which is a case that addresses these border issues in today's workshop. So I wouldn't read all of the CV that it's available online, but I would just give the floor to Mojca herself. I'm really happy that she's with us, and because we're a little bit late now. So Mojca, the floor is yours, and you have 45 minutes time, including the discussion.
Thank you very much, Urška. Good morning, everybody. My colleagues from Slovenia, Italy, Austria, new colleagues perhaps from United States, and so on. As Urška said, I'm going to present a topic that bothered me for a long time while I was doing field work in Carinthia, so that's southern part of Austria. What happened to me is that I was going to Carinthia every month for a week. Sorry, I need to do something to share screen. Okay, so I had no people to talk to. What is happening to me as to a researcher, and that's why I decided that I will write a field diary every evening or every night after I came from the field. And I actually found this technique very useful, although I was very tired after traveling Carinthia. I didn't have a car at the time, and so I used the buses and the trains. Or sometimes my colleagues from Ethnological Institute Urban Jarnik in Klagenfurt in Celovec took me to the field. But my decision was that I will transcribe every interview right after I came from the field, and after that I wrote field diary. And now I have field diary that is not published, that is used only for my well, now sentimental reasons maybe, but today I'm going to share some insights from the diary that I found quite useful while I was writing then the book, which was like a result of my doctoral dissertation. So I will shed light on the elementary theme of engaging with other people's life stories, which inevitably involve a personal interaction between the researcher and the narrator. The intertwining of at least two stories is evident in the act of empathy. As a consequence of identification with the interviewee during the interview and its transcription, so empathy, in the writing of the field diary by the investigator. Further, field diaries offer insights into the differences between the roles we take on as scholars in fieldwork and as people. So first, I will reflect on the importance of field diaries and empathy with my own experience. So that is experience that is a quarter of century old. I did this field work between 1996 and 1998. And I collected life stories in Austrian Carinthia collection entitled Tako smo živeli, življenjepisi koroških Slovencev. So that the literal translation would be That's How We Lived, life stories of Carinthian Slovenes, and 12 books of life stories were published since 1990s. So besides that, I wrote field diary for my personal use. And so now I'm going to share some parts of it with you. As oral sources, I used 76 biographies of Carinthian Slovenes, and they live in the linguistically most endangered southern part of Austria called Carinthia. My interviewees were born before 1930s. They were of peasant origin. Their highest level of education was vocational school. The temporal frame of the biographies was the period between the two wars and the referendum in 1920, because after that referendum, the southern part of Carinthia belonged to today's Austria. Actually, this year, 2020, is a mark for rapid Germanization of the Slovene community. Here we see, for instance, the numbers of people who declared themselves as Slovenes and how the number by the census in 2001 rapidly dropped. So geographical frame of my work were three valleys. In Slovene, Roš, Podjuna, Zilja, or in German, Rosenthal, Jauntal, and Gailtal. It's a lovely scenery. I have only two pictures of scenery, no cities, just to give you impression how this environment looks like. So here is where I traveled around. The social frame was represented by narrators of different professions, of different educational levels, and life circumstances, from maids, tenants, cottagers, and farmers to doctors, engineers, and mayors. In a book I later wrote, I have the biographical material into chapters illustrating everyday life, such as work, household, domestic routine, family activities, marriage, children, relationship with parents, discipline, school, religion, leisure, and death. The Corinthian biographies offer many local experiences to illuminate national and even international issues. Political, historical, and economic developments in Carinthia are interwoven with interpreted portions of biographies. Historical memory, which also shapes Slovenian national identity, among other things, is determined by the place of residence, work, occupation, and consumption. It describes family, work, illness, and the entire course of life from childhood to the teenage years to old age. The structure of biographical data is not random. I used a set of questions prepared by Slovene ethnologist Dr. Marija Makarovič, here she is on the left, which we later modified as the book collection Tako smo živeli, so that's how we lived, where the stories were published, became more popular. All life stories were written or recorded using a questionnaire with 13 sets of questions, focusing on home, work, family, leisure time, national consciousness, and life changes in old age. You can see here I had more women who were willing to talk to me than men. The reasons were different, but usually men said, "Oh, my wife knows more," or "Oh, this woman in the village would know more." So it was a snowball. You know, I had one person who talked to me, and then after an interview, I asked, who do you think might be willing or able to talk about me with this and sit with me for an hour or two? And so they sat, and women, of course, recommended women. Men also recommended women. So that was a snowballing that I used. But the fact factors that were the most important in the selection of my narrators were that the selected person declared her or himself as a Slovene, that he or she was born by the end of the World War II, and that he or she was from the countryside. So this peasant status of my narrators was not only the result of a deliberate methodological choice, but also of necessity, as the Slovenian population on Austrian Carinthia was predominantly peasant in the first half of the 20th century. This Slovene peasant structure in the countryside had no Slovene complement in the bourgeois structure of the towns and squares. The only Slovene intellectuals were essentially the Catholic priests who were connected to the village life and who also ran the culture, politics, economy of Carinthian Slovenes. In Carinthia, there were only a few Slovene teachers, civil servants, lawyers, or doctors. The bourgeoisie had distinctly German character in the Slovene part of Carinthia. German-speaking compatriots dominated trade, large-scale crafts, transportation, as well as growing tourism, industry, and the provincial administration. The few Slovenes who established themselves in bourgeois society were always on the threshold of assimilation. This historical fact was also a reason why the collection of biographies from Carinthian Slovenes focused on rural areas. In all cases, the interviews with the narrators took place in the Slovene language or in a colloquial language or a local dialect. The narrators also knew German more or less well. The narrators and their parents were all Slovenes, at least in terms of colloquial language, but some of their children were no longer enrolled in Slovenian schools, so these children knew little or no Slovene. They were subjects who can be seen as a link in the chain of the assimilation process. This process goes from a former Slovene family, so parents of my interviewees, to a family of their children. So they were narrators from the collection of the stories, That's How We Lived, who were predominantly influenced by German socialization factors to their children's family, who were my generation then. And they lived predominantly in a German environment. So when predominantly in German schools, they had German friends and the like. Although some of the narrator's children and grandchildren attended a bilingual kindergarten school or Slovene high school in Klagenfurt or Celovec in Slovenia, they continued their education mainly in Austria or found employment in a German environment. The narrators from the book collection are therefore deliberately selected according to their age, as their testimonies can also be a source for the study of assimilation. In writing my own Carinthian field diary, I must add immodestly, I also had a model. Bronislaw Malinowski's diary in the strict sense of the term from 1967. Malinowski's diary of around 19 months of field research conducted in New Guinea between September 1914 and July 1918, with breaks when he was in Australia, is really compelling, also disturbing, and acutely raw read, even for the non-anthropologist. For the prospective ethnographer, it brings into stark contradiction the very foundation of the impartial observer, as we say in anthropology. Uncovered among Malinowski's paper following his premature death in 1942, it was to be 25 years before diary was published, and even then accompanied by a great deal of anxiety among those responsible for personal and academic reputation of the great man. as well as a preemptive apology for the expected outrage. Raymond Firth, a former pupil, friend, and collaborator of Malinowski, as well as distinguished anthropologist, wrote in a bit nervous introduction to the diaries that, I quote, certain passages may even nowadays offend or shock the reader, and some readers may be impressed by the revelation of elements of brutality, even degradation, which the record shows on occasion. My own reflection is on this to advise anyone who wishes to sneer at passages in this diary to be equally frank in his own thoughts and writings and then judge again. End of quote. So both Firth's introduction and Valetta Malinowski, so Valetta was his second wife, introduction to the diaries reveal a frantic attempt at both limiting any damage to Malinowski's professional and personal reputation and an equally nervous care to contain any damage to anthropology as a science and professional activity. In 1922, Malinowski wrote in Argonauts of Western Pacific, I quote, as to the actual method of observing and recording in fieldwork, this imponderabilia of actual life and of typical behavior, there is no doubt that the personal equation of the observer comes here more prominently than in the collection of crystallized ethnographic data. But here also the main endeavor must be to let facts speak for themselves. If making a daily round of the village, certain small incidents, characteristic forms of taking food, of conversing, of doing work are found occurring over and over again, they should be noted down at once. It is also important that this work of collecting and fixing impressions should begin early in the course of working, because certain subtle peculiarities which make an impression as long as they are novel cease to be noticed as soon as they become familiar. Others, again, can only be perceived with a better knowledge of the local conditions, and an ethnographic diary carried on systematically throughout the course of one's work in a district would be the ideal instrument for this sort of study. And if, side by side with the normal and typical, here I draw it, the ethnographer carefully notes the slight or the more pronounced deviations on it, he will be able to indicate the two extremes within which the normal moves. End of quote. So I try to follow these written rules that were written in the introduction and in the diary and other works of Malinowski. So in accordance with the assumption that any individual holding a given role internalizes to some degree the expectations and norms of action associated with the given position in society, my role as field researcher in Carinthia was constructed in accordance with the roles played by my interviewees. In order not to let this interaction fade from memory, I persistently recorded all forms of cooperation, also pain through my exaggerated empathy, and even crashes with my narrators during my fieldwork in the Austrian Carinthia, when I did not have the opportunity to discuss them with anyone. Thus, I disciplined myself, and my diary notes, like here in Slovene, just this is the few statements from the beginning of the first diary. So they remained for the time when I began to analyze the collected material. In addition to personal notes and observations about Carinthians, my field diary also contained documentary fragments about certain techniques and working methods, especially those extreme situations in which my investigative plans were unexpectedly thrown out of whack. For instance, when despite all my precautions, my dictaphone gave up and I had to repeat the entire interview, or when, at the narrator's request, I turned off the dictaphone for 2 hours and listened not only to her narration, but also her confession. Or when, for reasons of language, age, and personality, I spoiled the interview by asking certain questions at the wrong moment and in the wrong places. So writing my field diary inevitably involved empathizing with people and their fates. During the interviews, I often realized that the level of trust between my interviewees and myself depended on my own empathic capacity. So I recorded my own experience of the fieldwork each day in the form of detailed descriptions in my field diary. In a qualitative study, the researcher is aware of the impossibility of his or her own exclusion from the events he or she is investigating and influence on the events he or she is describing. The people studied react to the presence of a researcher or approach and to the interview situation itself. In addition, the researcher deeply experiences the events he or she is describing or investigating. A record of these experiences benefits the research. It allows others to verify the researcher's findings, and the description itself becomes more detailed and dense. In this way, the researcher as a person functions like a sensitive instrument that discovers new facts about the object under study based on his or her own feelings or rational reactions. So telling a life story is not a one-way process. It is always a dialogue in which either side can benefit from telling or listening. Reflecting on the content of the life story and the reciprocal process that occurs between interviewer and the narrator can be beneficial to both participants. Unlike other, more partial interviews, which are less concerned with the subject's personal experience of time, space, and society, an interview that focuses on one's life story brings a clearer perspective to the person's life. It deepens the knowledge about oneself, strengthens the self-image and self-respect of the person. The narrator shares his long-held memories of experiences and understanding of his or her own role in life with someone else. And that someone else can usually be a more unbiased listener than people the narrator lives with or knows well. The telling of a life story can certainly be a cleansing catharsis for the teller, or for the listener as well. The life story of another can help the listener and later, when it is published, the reader to understand his or her own life. It can inspire to learn something from another's life or to use another's experience in place of his or her own. And the present helps both the interviewer and the narrator to clarify their expectations for the future. This does not mean that everyone feels the same way about their own lives. Some people look back with regret and pain, others with joy, still others with indifference. What touched me most about my Corinthian narrators were their answers to my sub-questions, which were not provided in the questionnaire, such as, what would you change if you were young again? Or if there had been no war, if you had been able to go to school, and so on. They answered these questions with the conviction that their lives, as they had been, had been meaningful and necessary, even if they could have changed some of their past decisions or redirected the course of events. Several conversations with other life storytellers confirmed my situation. For many writers, myself included, oversensitivity or lack of knowledge about the role of empathy in interview situations led to an exchange of identities, sometimes causing difficulties in distinguishing between the narrator's own experience and that of the researcher. I'm going to give you one example from my field diary dated on the 10th of October 1996. So that was also the date when in 1920 the plebiscite was held in Carinthia. It goes like this. In the afternoon, I go to Paula's again. So the names are changed to Paula. This time they are at home. The narrator is a little less articulate, but she is the type of woman who sincerely believes that the world can be beautiful and just, despite what she has experienced. Such women do not doubt the faith from which they draw certainty. At least in their confessions, they already give a recipe for how things could be better. They also set a pattern by their example. I just admire what masters they are at it, which is not to say that I idolize holy simplicity. No, quite the opposite. Things are not as simple and smooth as they first appear. In my further questions, therefore, I dare go no further than a cautious probing. The most important advisor in this is my Mrs. Intuition. I always know when she is sitting next to me. Then I feel myself spontaneously widening my eyes and opening my mouth slightly as I listen to my interlocutor. That's when my saliva somehow tastes more pleasant and flows more abundantly than usual, and when the outer corners of my eyes get moist. That's when it's time for sensitive questions. The chemistry of the human body and intuition are intimately connected, but it is necessary to be disciplined. Since Paula's oldest daughter is still in the conversation, I include her too, and she also wants to join in the conversation. That's good, because otherwise Paula won't remember a single year. But the story has to be in time, space, and social setting. In fact, the daughter born in the early 1930s is quite unhappy. She is single, she is unmarried and living at home, which means she's lonely and that her choice of status wasn't entirely voluntarily. I always kind of feel sorry for people who, for some reason, had to accept the fact that they were going to grow old and die without raising a family they wanted. That's still a big value here in Carinthia. Paula's daughter's defense and protection is that she smokes cigarette after cigarette because of the uncertainty and because then she can stop thinking about herself for a moment. How many more Slovenes like this are there here in Carinthia? How many are doubly lonely, lonely as people, and because of their mother tongue? So here is the end of this report or field diary. And because I had nobody to talk to on the field, I had to set some rules to myself when I was doing field work. And I advised myself something very important, and it is connected to empathic listening. So although all types of listening are important, the empathic type of listening is most important for improving interpersonal communication. This is especially important when emotions are involved in the narrative. So I somehow set some rules that were important to me. And the first rule was consider the position of the interviewee. So we must want to listen. We must be genuinely interested in what the person is thinking and feeling. This is especially difficult in interpersonal conflicts because we are overwhelmed with our own ideas and feelings. And it is important to explore the interviewee's point of view and not avoid it. Then, secondly, before responding to the interviewee, we need to make sure that we fully understand what he or she is saying. Third, we check the interlocutor's understanding by paraphrasing. So if we think we understand the interviewee, we check this by paraphrasing. We reproduce in our own words what he or she said. Paraphrasing is not repetition, and it's not putting things off. And then last, in paraphrasing, we express emotional and contextual. But nevertheless, when listening, we should not be completely focused on our interlocutors. In the same way, we can listen to ourselves and paraphrase our own views. And this is why diary is important. In empathic listening, we distinguish between three types of attention that are followed by a specific behavior. So first, non-verbal attention. What would it mean? So how we sit in conversation, how we look, our gaze. So if we have appropriate distance, how we lean forward if necessary, how we maintain eye contact, if we have a relaxed posture, if we nod, if we smile, if we have lively facial expressions. And then what is important is also psychological attention, so that there is an absence of internal disturbances or concentration on the interlocutors and not on ourselves. So absence of external disturbances. So that means that phone doesn't ring all the time, or somebody walks through the room, we have interview, etc. And so psychological privacy or appropriate space in which the conversation takes place. And also the verbal attention. That means that we don't interrupt when it is not necessary, that we use one word verbal stimuli, like aha, or I understand, or something like that. So short sentences with which we gain and express confidence, follow the content or stay on the topic. Silence. So it is important also to be silent. We don't need to talk all the time. Silence is necessary when we have interviews because some situations need some more reflection from the people that sit in front of us. So excessive talking is not recommended. So this is what I found out because I am excessive talk. And now, well, I did the field, as you could see from the pictures, at their homes, but I also visited nursery homes. And here is well, apart from my diary, when I visited nursery home in Carinthia. The lady is so small that she is simply lost on the bench on which she's sitting. She has a big hump on her back and a strangely bent right leg from the hip. She talks in a relaxed manner, trying to answer my questions in as little dialect as possible. Her life is marked by the fact that nobody liked her, and there is probably worse, but I will never know. As a woman, I can only guess at her anguish. She is the first person I interview who says she wouldn't want to live the way she did. She wouldn't marry or have children, she says. Though she later corrects herself that she wants the life she's living. This makes me think, I think the first response is honest and impulsive, and the second is fear of the unknown. That's how I explain it to myself. In her life, she encountered even the crudest of people who probably saw her as a suitable, movable object over which to rave and to hate. I can't even imagine that such a tiny 92-year-old woman could endure all that. She says she prays and begs for death now. God has always heard her. Uh, of that, she has no doubt, and she is sure He will this time too. This is truly from another world, which I can only understand because of my ability to vividly imagine the situation. So it goes on and on, my description in field diary, but I was like personally hurt to see the situation of a disabled person having no contacts with her family and being actually really an object of sadistic actions in her past. And it hurt me in a way. I wrote practically the whole night in the diary what I felt about it. I had nobody to talk about it. So in analyzing Corinthian life stories, the narratives of some of the narrators have long persisted with me. Sometimes, while transcribing and later analyzing life stories, I even relived interview situations or events from the narrators' lives in my dreams. I dreamt often. I dreamt for years about them. It was not uncommon for women, in particular, to hold my hand or start talking to me as to someone very close during interviews. In doing so, they unintentionally expressed trust or tried to adopt me in other ways by confiding me things that they had not yet given to any of the relatives at home. The men, on the other hand, often shed tears unintentionally over memories they had already tried to repress. I was kind of unprepared for that. Slovenian culture on the southern part of Karavanke Mountains, which is the border between Austria and Slovenia, so this culture, Slovenian culture here is a macho culture. So this is how I feel this culture. But Carinthian Slovenes are much more tender, a different world and a culture shock, really, only 100 kilometers away from my home. Unless the narrators asked about it themselves, I sealed such parts of the interview or turned off the dictaphone. In all cases, however, it was clearly about more than just a collection of biographical material. It was also about interpersonal relationship. It was about trust. Some narrators understood the interview not just as a narration, but as a confession. The need for purification and the gratitude for having listened to them, they confirmed to me either immediately or when I visited them a second time and brought them a transcribed interview for authorization, or when I brought them the book from the collection, That's How We Lived, Life Stories of Corinthian Slovenes, in which their life story was published. The relationship between the narrator and the listener of a life story is not a friendly one, so don't forget that, because it does not take place on an equal footing. It is limited in space and time and involves professional work. Nevertheless, it has all the characteristics of a good intimate relationship. It involves empathy, respect, and sincerity. A good interpersonal relationship has a positive effect even if it is completely informal and involves people without professional qualifications who do not know methods and techniques like we use in ethnology. It should be kept in mind that the narrator may not understand the rules of the professional relationship. So it should be made clear to him that it is it is participation in a project that will end. It is possible that a friendship will develop as the research nears its end, but in the middle of the project, it is better to maintain a professional relationship than to create a friendship. It is also not fair or wise to suggest that a friendship will continue after the research if the researcher is not convinced that he or she wants to and can continue the friendship. Therefore, you should be able to establish warmth, acceptance, encouragement, approval, empathy, receptivity, and sensitivity during the interview. Social roles uh, um, are somehow determined and expected. It is expected what we do in the field. Um, there is no way an ethnologist can escape the role that her gender entails. There is no neutral position here. If you are a woman, you get certain information only from women. And conversely, a lot also depends on what you research. In a rural, patriarchal setting, women ethnologists have virtually unlimited access to data on households, children, education, women's activities, gossip networks, the elderly, sometimes even sexual life, and so on. But even in doing so, they must conform to the role that their interlocutors tacitly expect of them. For example, that they themselves are married, that they have children, that they are old enough, that they do not smoke or drink. Some researchers, if they are lucky, can skip some of these unwritten rules, but not all. I skipped almost all these unwritten rules because I was unmarried. I had no children at the time. Well, I'm no smoker, no drinker. Well, okay. I just had to get their trust. I'm going to read the last passage from one of my memories from 1996 about gaining trust. So it goes like this. My interviewee and I develop trust in each other, especially when we talk about family, children, and raising them. At one point, I inadvertently embarrass her by asking her something too directly that comes naturally to me, but not to her. There were 50 years of difference between us. I tell her she doesn't have to answer if she doesn't want to. I don't want to force anything on her. Although I have a feeling she would like to tell me what it was like when she first came to the farm. She decides not to disappoint me, or so I think, and asks me to turn off the recorder. Then she speaks. Meanwhile, she takes my hand several times and looks me in the eyes. I wonder how many people she has confided in. I'm sure it's only been a few. She speaks to me like to her daughter, and I feel very close to her. Then I quote her again. I ask her to show me the family photos, and then she explains next to them. She also lends me the whole family album, so the whole box in the shoebox, until the next day, what is a great privilege. So here is the end of quote from my diary. And to conclude, so you could see from these passages, it is clear that the interview not only has one-way effect, but can also learn something about ourselves in the interview situation. We can observe ourselves as interviewers. And I don't think it's a bad thing if we like or dislike the narrator a lot. If we admit that to ourselves, that maybe we will not like all people on the field, but we will still do interviews with them, we can move on with less effort and record a life story to the end. So researchers have long shyly denied the influence of field experience on their own lives, the importance of their own biography to observation and interpretation. Sometimes the researcher would have to admit that his or her presence in the field, and then he or she disappeared from the text. That's wrong. Today, we demand that the researcher remains in the text. The field the field is never just a world of others, but a world between us and the others. And moreover, each description is somewhere between autobiography and anthropology. The meaning of the researcher's personal experience, hidden in what is written in field diary, becomes part of textual analysis. The researcher's autobiography is hidden in the biographies of the narrators, and their biographies are determined in the researcher's life. So this is here where I would like to stop. All they were without context, by purpose, because I wanted to tell you two stories at the same time. So it was a didactical decision. So one, to listen to what I have to say to you, and another, to look at the pictures which I gathered at Carinthia fieldwork, which are now kept in my personal archive, and they are also kept at the Ethnological Institute Urban-Jarnik in Klagenfurt. So of course, I had their hospitality. I had the room. I had a computer there, and I left all the material that I gathered there. But of course, then I concluded this 2 long-year story of collecting material with my PhD and later publishing the book. Portret glasov, življenjske zgodbe koroških Slovencev. It's a long time since I did it, and I must say, and that's the last statement, I'm very proud of this book. Not just because it was my first book, but also because I had no literature here in Slovenia. Nobody wrote at that time about oral history. I had to go abroad to actually be shocked how much literature exists on this topic, and then go on with more certainty and do my other books, also including oral history. Thank you very much for listening to me. I hope I was not too long. I hope I did not actually, I hope it wasn't too boring to you. Thank you.
No, Mojca, it wasn't boring at all, although it was too long. We don't have many time for the questions if you want to stick to the schedule. So maybe I would ask if someone has a question on what was told. There are many interesting, many impressive perspectives. Dagmar, I saw your hand. So please, Dagmar.
Yes, thank you so much for a superb talk and an illuminating lecture. I have many questions. I will limit myself to one. I was particularly struck and intrigued by the snowball effect, the chain reaction effect you described, that men pointed you towards women as perhaps storytellers, the keepers of the past. So I keyed in the chat section. I have basically a question about gender and narrative practice, or the narrative tradition, since Irene is a project about gender. And I was wondering whether you could contextualize that or elaborate about that a little bit further.
Thank you very much, Dagmar. That was also one of the questions that I ask myself all the time. And I think there were two things. Men were maybe a little bit embarrassed because I was very frank and direct, and this is my normal way of communicating, and I wasn't pretending anything at the fieldwork. And maybe I had scared them a little bit. So they said, oh, my wife will tell you all that. But sometimes, men were also present either at parts of interviews, either in other sorts of communication outside of the house. And so they saw that maybe I'm not such a threat. So they were willing to cooperate. But sometimes the institute in Klagenfurt just said, oh, we found somebody, a man, who would be willing to talk to you. It was rather exceptional than a rule. And I was so happy to have a male to communicate with. So men of 70s, 80s, or 90s, 90 years old, who were very talkative. Well, sometimes we had some communication problems because they didn't understand me well. I mean, I tried to speak in the best Slovene I can, and I try to speak slowly and without any excessive difficult words. But they were able to speak only in dialect. So sometimes men needed a translator, and the translator was their wife, or the translator was the son, or something like that. But yes, as you said, it is a problem, and I think if I were a man, maybe I would get another statistical number of who were my interviewees. But yes, this is a fact. I asked on the field who else would be appropriate, and they gave me information, or institute just knew somebody. They phoned and arranged everything for me, and sometimes also they took me to the field with a car. So it was a great experience, unforgettable experience for me, because at the time I was like 26, 27 years old, and I never had close contact to such old people. I mean, with deep conversations. I don't mean this superficial contacts that you have in everyday life, but I never asked anything in my life to such old people. All my grandparents were already dead at that time, So for me, it was a really, really great experience and a culture shock. Again, it was a culture shock. 100 kilometers away from Ljubljana, where I live, I could find a completely new world I didn't know anything about. Because what we know about Carinthian Slovenes here in Slovenia is mostly focused on the political situation and not on everyday life. And I tried to avoid political situation, but and try to ask only how they were living. So yeah, this is it.
Thank you, Mojca. I'm